Hi, everyone. Welcome to 3AF's Fall Webinar Series. I'm Jenny Hom-Franzen, the 3AF's Executive Director. Before I turn things over to our speaker, Day Nam at Asian Media Group, I wanted to share a little bit about 3AF. I know that some of you are familiar with us. You've been to our events and our summit, but others of you may not know about 3AF. So we are the leading resource when it comes to Asian advertising, Asian marketing, and the power of the Asian American consumer. You can find out more about us on our website, www.3af.org, or you can follow us on social media. We're primarily on LinkedIn, sometimes on Facebook. Also, I wanted to make sure that you sign up for our email news. That way, you're going to be hearing about our events and programs and initiatives. And more importantly, I'd like to encourage you to attend our 3F Asian Marketing Summit. It's the largest national conference focusing on the Asian consumer. Obviously, you're interested because you're here on the webinar today. Our event is typically in May. It might be in June next year, but we'll be sending out an announcement soon about the date and the venue. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We are recording today's session. We plan to post the link for the recording as well as the deck on the website, maybe in about a week or so. And then in terms of questions, please feel free to type your questions into the chat box, or the question box, I guess, and we'll take as many questions as we can at the end when Day is finished with her presentation. So please help me welcome Day Nam, Director, Strategic Partnerships, Asian Media Group. Day, over to you.
Thank you, Jenny. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for calling in either in the morning or afternoon or during your lunch hour, depending on where you are. I really appreciate your attention and time out of your day to learn about the exciting topic and the subject material that I think was in the pre-read that was sent out. So my name is Day. As Jenny mentioned, I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships at Asian Media Group. We are a dedicated member of 3AF. As Jenny mentioned also, please make sure you join the summit in May or June of 2025 for more great content. But today, given that we only have about 40 minutes with leaving time for questions at the end, what I really want to do is jump right in and basically address why. Like why does 3F, why do we do what we do? Why should clients and agencies and everyone in advertising and media and creative, really across the industry in general, why should we care? And some of this content, which I will share now. Let's see. Looks like, okay, you don't see this. Some of this content that I'm going to share today is really going back into like, why does cultural advertising, why does culture in general matter for advertising, which should be something that we can all answer off the top of our heads, but I know it gets forgotten sometimes in the bigger picture and knowing all the different things that we have to worry about being, advertising professionals. So some of that is that, and then some of it is really towards the economic opportunity in and of itself when it comes to Asian Americans, who are one of the most concentrated and targetable and scalable groups, audience segments in the US today. So we'll go into hard numbers on that, as well as some vertical specific data and just kind of ground level insights to help pad the case and the rationale. But just starting off with a little bit about AMG, who Asian Media Group is. And I will say, I do want to say this is kind of slightly off topic here, but we have been getting a lot of people going to amg.biz instead of our website, which is www.asianmedia.com. That is our website. We're US based. That is, we're an independent. That is our company. So I want to get that out of the way. But who we are, we've been around for almost 40 years now, with 20 of those in digital alone. Obviously, about 40 years ago when we started out, Asian wasn't a thing. Asian American wasn't even really a term that people use, and it was only about 2% of the population. So if you know how hard of a sell it is today, if you look at all the work that 3AF does, AMG does, and all the Asian vendors do in terms of just selling the audience today, and how much of an uphill battle that is, you can just imagine what it was like 36 years ago. And so we've really stayed around because of our ability to consistently deliver on expertise, market data, market insight, and ultimately performance when it comes to the Asian American audience, even when it was 2% of our US population, all the way up to now, to where we have much more traction, visibility, luckily, to build on. So with that out of the way, go into a little bit about the audience itself. So I'm sure all of you, or a lot of you by now, have seen the $1.6 trillion in buying power. You know it's ahead of schedule. I think that a while ago, Asian Americans were projected to reach 1.6 trillion in 2027, and we're a few years ahead of schedule. But I think what's actually more interesting about that is that it's highly concentrated. It's still growing with an upwards trend that's again steeper than projected, and it is long lasting with higher years of effective buying power per consumer. So those all just kind of put a little bit more context into it. And that concentration is especially important, just to put it into context. The $1.6 trillion in spending power is almost on par with US Hispanic and AA audiences, despite being 1/3 and 1/2 of the size, respectively. So that just kind of gives you an idea of what that concentration is per consumer reach and per household reach. It's also highly concentrated from a geographic perspective, as you can see this sort of heat map here with concentration of population around the SF Bay Area, which everyone knows that Silicon Valley has some of the highest concentration of buying power. New York City almost goes without saying with the buying power concentrated there. You see the North Virginia, DC area, as well as Southern California and the Seattle Metro, as well as some of the major Texas metros, which are actually the fastest growing in Asian American population and thus buying power. And those align really well with not just population centers, but also, again, economies and spending power. So what that means is that from an efficiency perspective, it's actually highly efficient because you don't have to, unlike with the general population, where you might have to think a little bit about kind of what markets, assuming this is a national brand or a global brand, what markets really, where are those buying power centers, and how do we make sure that our visibility, our brand is getting to those consumers with that concentration of buying power more effectively. And that goes even for things like CPG, non-big ticket purchases. People need extra buying power to be able to consider and have the freedom to buy name brand products, which are mostly the brands that we're working on. Most of us here. I can't see who's here, but I would assume so. So with Asian Americans, that really takes that a little bit out of the picture. You know that the Asian American population has that concentration of buying power, and you know that it aligns with these population centers geographically. So that takes out a lot of that need for really tight geo-targeting, which as we know can get expensive and difficult and just in terms of overhead complicates things a lot further. So altogether, you have effective years of buying power, geography, and just concentration of buying power per capita. Now, when we look at how Asians consume media, because I think the question naturally at this point, as I'm sure has popped into your head, whether or not you've submitted it in the chat, and please do ask your questions so we don't have the awkward silence at the end. But I'm sure it's popped into your head. How do we reach Asian Americans then? So great, they're concentrated in these areas that we've already touched upon, but are we getting them with our spread in just Gen Pop media? We're reaching some Asian Americans, right? I mean, impossible not to. And that is true. You are definitely reaching some Asian Americans. But it's a matter of where you can connect with us, where it's showing that the brand has like intentionality and reach. Because I think, me as an Asian American seeing an Asian woman in an ad in the New York Times is a little bit different, a little bit creepy that I'm being followed around in the New York Times versus seeing that same ad in culturally relevant or endemic media sources. So going into a little bit about the media, Asian endemic media is not just a preference, it's actually a mechanism for building trust and making that intentional connection with Asian American audiences. Because if we go back towards what it means to capitalize on diverse segments in general, that means creating an emotional connection with those consumers. For every emotional engagement or an emotional connection that a consumer makes with a brand, they go on to use that brand for an average of 4 years, which is dozens of purchasing cycles, depending on the product. And so when we think about kind of what that means for media, that does mean expanding our media universe as a business imperative for US advertisers, not just kind of an optionality, but we have to rethink what our media universe really means and how we invest in those different media universes, in those different cultural universes, and how we show up in front of those consumers in a way that's intentional and really builds that emotional connection, as I mentioned. So building higher trust and credibility, enhanced message retention, and efficient reach of targeted audiences here are really key and driven primarily by making sure that you're in those culturally endemic or ethnically endemic media sources. As you see, sourced from Edelman Trust Barometer, Nielsen, and McKinsey, all very trustworthy sources from the past 2 or 3 years of data. These are all kind of tie into making sure that you're using targeted media as a way to eliminate waste of impressions and make sure that you're not just in front of the right consumers in the right proportions, but that you're actually making that connection. Again, to go back to the question from before, how do I know I'm reaching Asian Americans? Well, you got to show up where Asian Americans are showing up and connecting with. Not just getting eyeballs on your brand that happen to be Asian, but getting those eyeballs to recognize that my brand is intentionally seeing our audience and making an effort to reach out and putting really their dollars behind kind of what their advertising strategies are. Consumers are smart now. They recognize the ad choices logo. They recognize when they're being followed around. Um, and some of them don't mind, and some of them do. They do reward brands that ultimately make that effort with their purchases. So this Deloitte uh, data at the bottom, consumers are 2.5 times more likely to purchase from a brand they feel understands their culture and speaks directly to their values. That can be accomplished through a lot of different ways. But towards what we're saying today, I think media and creative are two very, very important components for showing that a brand, truly understands and is making that effort to connect culturally. Endemic media is also a way to avoid tone-deaf messaging. I think another question that we get a lot just in kind of sales meetings or just client meetings in general, we get asked, how do we avoid and people kind of ask this in different, slightly awkward ways, but essentially what they're trying to say is how do we avoid offending people? We don't want to become the next Bud Light or whatever kind of example. We don't want to be the next one who kind of shows up as being tone deaf or offending people. And so actually a lot of brands will use that as an excuse to just not be in front of the audience in general, thus missing out on the scale and size of this opportunity. But that's not really the right way to go about it, right? Because that totally just at that point, you could have effectively just not listened to this whole presentation. You could have just forgotten about, connecting with consumers culturally at all, and you're missing out on that opportunity. But if you want to actually make sure that you're following through and you're executing on it, but you are still avoiding that tone-deaf messaging, the best way to do that is, again, to trust those vendors and those media sources and those publishers and those platforms that live and breathe that audience and that culture. And the only way to do that is to make sure you're working directly with some of those partners, make sure that you're listening to what their insights are. Partners and publishers and platforms, they do not want to steer you wrong. It hurts them just as much as it hurts you to have a campaign not perform, not resonate, or offend users. So you have to have that trust in those platforms. And one of the ways that you know that you're doing that right is by working directly with those platforms or vendors that specialize in that audience. Now, moving forward, this is on the right here. This is one just kind of not really a case study, but just kind of an example of how we're able to build over time on these investments. It's not just a matter of checking a box or making sure that advertisers know that, okay, we got to be in front of Asians, but how do we actually make sure that we are moving the needle in such a way that increases investments over time in the audience via performance. The one on the right is an example of an automotive brand. We work with many automotive brands, so we're not sharing which one this is, but it's a European brand that has spent well into the seven figures in 2024 and looking to continue that into 2025. With those efforts aligning with market share gains by 1.5 points. It's not really a brand that you would associate with Asians, again, European automotive. But it is a brand that we've been working with starting from I think about a 5-figure budget several years ago, going to well into the mid 7 figures. They don't have any D&I budgets as far as I know. They don't even really have multicultural per se, but they've noticed that just by capitalizing on the data, the market data that we've already shared a little bit of, and that we're going to share more in the next few minutes here, they've been able to grow that market share and grow that performance. So, both client and agency in this case have been very happy with that. AMG has been very happy with this partnership and success. So just wanted to throw a little example in there of how all of this data is actually relevant in real time in making sure that it's moving the needle and it's actually driving efforts forward rather than just checking a box. Because as I'm sure you've noticed so far, we're very, very focused on numbers, which we believe are essentially irrefutable. I think across conversations, when we talk about, multicultural or cultural relevance, I think that people have gotten the wrong idea. They've lost the plot a little bit along the way, and I think sometimes advertisers can think, when I hear Asian or when I hear multicultural, I think box checking, I think doing the right thing, I think investing with minority owned publishers, they're not thinking about it correctly anymore, which is how do we make sure that we're capitalizing on these opportunities efficiently and effectively via using vendors that can facilitate that cultural and emotional engagement between their audiences that they know very well and our brand. And how can they do that efficiently, without a lot of like overhead buy-in from clients, and make sure that that gets executed on with scalable partnerships over time. So that's what this example on the right is supposed to show. Now, this is kind of granular, so this is just a couple slides here, but I just want to paint a picture of just why kind of like if this opportunity is so great, and we've been around for almost 40 years, why hasn't it why don't we see more of it? Why isn't it more visible? Why are we just now gaining a lot more momentum in the space? And I think that we, like every segment, are are kind of prone to the ups and downs or all the whims of the industry at large. And I think that with the total market experiment and kind of the shift to trying to execute on everything programmatically over time, you'll see that that is kind of been detrimental to the audience's overall growth because it doesn't really prove out performance. As you'll see, Asian American is the least visible data set in third-party data, with targeting Asian Americans only being about 27% accurate when you do it programmatically. Now, if you get into specific ethnicities, Chinese versus Korean versus Vietnamese versus Indian, that it's non-existent, as you can imagine. So we'll get into why that's important as well, but this is just sort of to paint the picture as to why it hasn't really been, why the industry's broader trends and broader inclinations have been sort of a detriment to the growth of Asian American performance and investment, performance and thus investment over time. So with that being said, Asian Media Group is 100% media direct, and that's really the way we're able to deliver. We are the only vendor in the industry at this time and at any time that has consistently delivered on ethnic accuracy with each and every impression. And as I just mentioned, that goes even further than the 27% accuracy in defining Asian American. We're going towards, or we're delivering on ethnic accuracy, meaning Chinese versus Indian, etc., with every single impression. So that really only comes from an attention to detail, and really a vendor that truly believes that Asian American isn't just a box to check. It's not just an audience to kind of have eyeballs, from on your ad. It's an audience that deserves the kind of intentionality and care that every other culture and every other audience segment receives when you're making an intentional effort to target them. And kind of things like this data goes into data like this. It leads to 6 out of 10 Asian Americans pointing to experiences of discrimination or violence, and not seeing themselves in positions of power, as to just generally not feeling like they belong or are not accepted. And that is a huge pain point, not feeling like we belong, not feeling like we're accepted. Only 18% of Asian Americans completely agree that they're accepted in the US for a racial identity. These are all products of what happens when you try to just kind of mush audiences into your total market experiment or your programmatic strategies, or you're just, trying to just treat it kind of like, just something that you could check a box and move on. You need to fully understand the audience, the culture, and that is understandably not very like efficient sounding. And that's why you have vendors like AMG, and there are a few others that really understand the audience and that can help you action on that without putting anyone off, while driving performance, while making sure it's scalable, and they can do it efficiently behind the scenes while not costing you a lot of that overhead in terms of labor and thought investment. So this is kind of our last long section here, and then we'll move into questions. But these are going back towards market data, really I really want to drive home the importance economically of this opportunity, because I think it gets overlooked a lot. People they understand that Asians make more money. They understand that Asians have, maybe higher educational attainment, but they don't really understand, they don't really know on a very, very granular scale what that means. So they don't understand that, for example, 32% of Asian Americans have a median household income of 277K, versus only about 19% of the general population, with 80% of Asian Americans as a whole, Asian American households, falling into middle and upper income. Now, I think a lot of people then think, well, if their household sizes are bigger, doesn't that account for a lot of it? But no, it doesn't account for a lot of it. It doesn't even account for most of it. It does, of course, contribute a little bit to that higher household income. But when we actually break it down further, which we're going to do, it paints a very different picture. Now I'll go back into kind of what that looks like from an employment perspective, what industries Asian Americans are highly influential in. But ethnic segmentation does need to be touched upon. Again, AMG is the only vendor that can accurately address segmentation at scale and resonantly with every single impression that we deliver on from from a digital media perspective. We are a digital first vendor first and foremost. That ethnic segmentation roughly looks like this. This is a little bit different than I think it exists in the media universe itself. For example, Filipino endemic media is much less scalable, so that square would be smaller if you're looking at it from a media universe perspective. But other than that, I mean, this is pretty accurate. This is just sheer population in the US, but it's fairly one-to-one with media impression availability too. Anyway, as you can see, it's highly segmented with Indians and Chinese being the most visible. I think Indians are now the largest single ethnicity Asian segment. AMG does target all of these groups at scale across, all major digital platforms. And this kind of like, I think this diagram is great because it separates it out visually and it kind of goes against that like horrible tired stereotype of all Asians look the same or all Asians are the same, which, all Asian Americans, or most, I guess I can't speak for everyone, but I certainly find that, offensive. And it's definitely something that I grew up hearing or kind of thinking that other people thought. And so making sure that you're working with a vendor that understands that and that can address that efficiently and at scale without off-putting, putting off consumers is really important. This speaks more to overall like multicultural Americans, not just Asian Americans, but Asians are a part of that. Educational attainment. Now going back to the income, this is part of what contributes to that. 59, almost 60% of Asian Americans have a bachelor's degree compared to 38% of Americans overall. Asian Americans are also highly overrepresented as software engineers, surgeons, physical scientists, medical scientists, chief executives, and computer hardware engineers, all of which are not only higher paying than average, but also more stable. And so when we see economic headwinds or downturns or just like pessimism overall, we actually see kind of relatively flat investments from our clients or sometimes even higher investments because we see that recognition of, all right, we can't, we got to think about who's still spending money, who's still feeling optimistic, who's still traveling, buying luxury goods, buying high-end skincare, buying new cars. And Asian Americans tend to still do all of those, of course, to a slightly lesser extent than at just, economically optimistic times, but more so than the general population. They feel those headwinds a little bit less, speaking as a whole, of course. AAPI role models are highly diverse, and we're seeing this kind of change over time. We're seeing a lot more representation, I think, on screen, which is great. A lot more representation in the business world with the former Pepsi CEO and the founder of NYX Cosmetics, which is now owned by L'Oreal. We're seeing a lot more of that representation there. There's a lot less of that just being relegated to stereotypes, which also means for brands that there's a lot more kind of fun that can be done from a creative perspective or from, a native perspective or from a custom content perspective. There's just a lot more to play with in a good way than we had when we first started out, certainly. Now, the income, I think this graph is really important to paint a picture because it shows not only the trend lines, my own face is covering the graph here, okay. Not only the trend lines, but also that the gap continues to widen, right? If you look at like the very far right, the 2022 there on the graph, you'll see that gap is larger than ever. And I know, that is something that kind of is outpacing the overall it just shows that the trend line, if you kind of do a line of best fit, those look at where that's coming from. And we predict that to continue to grow because part of that is due to everything I just said, the kind of areas of occupation, the education, and tying into that is also that Asian American immigration is at its highest right now. Currently in sheer numbers, APAC immigration to the US now outpaces that of Latin America. So that's not in just percentage. There are more Asian immigrants coming to the US than there are from Latin America, which is much closer and a huge continent, that borders the US. So that is huge. And because it's so much further away, that kind of, with like the visa policies being what they are, no comment on that, but that that does drive, that is really what's driving kind of that. Like, it's nothing really about necessarily like Asian culture. It's really just that the US basically is kind of selecting for these like higher income immigrants. And that is what's driving that, largely what's driving that income differential, education differential, and then also um, that change in over time. So that's something that you need to also, going back to media, and I want to tie everything back to media because really that's what's at the end of the day how it gets executed on. Going back to media, that immigration growth is really what's driving that scalability in Asian endemic media, in terms of US inventory. Because now today you have about 75 to 80% of Asian American adults having been born overseas, which is huge. So 18 plus alone. And that's, generally when I think about buying power, those are the people who, heads of households, able to buy our stuff. This is more financial success. I think the important part here is really that second bullet point with Asian Americans being more satisfied with personal finances in general. Over half are just, kind of say they feel satisfied with their personal finances, which means what? More comfortability to pick and choose on the brands or be able to just kind of choose the brand name over the private label, at the very low end of cost for CPG, or at the higher end, are they able to consider that luxury product, that luxury jewelry or skincare or car? Asian Americans are highly technologically uh, adaptable. They're considered those kind of early tech adopters. They were the fastest to adopt smartphones. That's not really as much of a thing anymore, but that will continue when it comes to things like, streaming services or, who knows? I know everyone's talking about AI, so I won't, but every kind of tech product that we see, consumer tech, who is able to buy it and who wants to buy it, who like cares about the newest consumer tech? Well, Asians are really probably the largest targetable segment that quote unquote cares about that. Um, Food, I think food is important for every multicultural segment. So I'm not really speaking to cuisines per se on this, but I'm speaking more to the fact that Asian American households spend a lot more on food in general. They spend more on takeaway food, fine dining, and food at home. So groceries, right? They just are they're less likely to be really paying closely attention to that food expenditure, which I think is important for all food and beverage brands. And also very swayable by advertising. I think McDonald's was the most preferred QSR brand among Asian Americans, which isn't necessarily, sometimes it can be explained away by like location or, but for in that case, all of the experts, including I think Placed, who released that study, kind of pointed to it being because of those dedicated advertising and media efforts over time. And that was both national and local. Automotive is a huge one. I'm sure there are some on the call that we already work with, and automotive, we work across, I think we've worked across almost every major auto brand with a US presence across the years. And Asian Americans are really a key consumer group in that industry. Now, prior, just because of their affinity for luxury and preference for buying new cars and ability to buy new cars, but now, particularly because they are early adopters of electric vehicles. I believe out of the first three countries in the world where an all-electric car led in sales, China and Korea were two of them. Norway was the third. So that just kind of shows that openness. And then a McKinsey report last year showed that over half of Indian car buyers, so in India, were plan on buying a hybrid or EV within the next year, in the near future. So that really just kind of shows. And I think overseas data, again, if we remember that about 80% of Asian American adults were born overseas, overseas data is really one of the best forecasting indicators that we can use. That's not really a lagging indicator. Forecasting indicator that we can use to show what those cultural preferences and habits may be pretty soon among the Asian American audience. So that's why I'm mentioning overseas data. Of course, our like internally the way we work is not based on overseas data, but I'm just speaking as kind of a cultural indicator. So I'll wrap this up in the next 5 minutes and leave room for questions. Travel, but I want to wrap this up with more vertical specific data. Obviously, financial services and automotive are kind of the obvious ones where everyone knows, they've been doing Asian reach for years. But travel is less obvious. I think people think when they think travel, they think, okay, yeah, Asians going to Asia, flying from SFO or LAX to Asia, and that certainly is part of it. But Asian Americans, what people don't really know is that against the non-Hispanic white segment in the US, Asian Americans over-index on travel to Europe, the Middle East, and the Caribbean. And Europe by, I think, a factor of more than 150 in terms of their index against non-Hispanic white Americans. Those are not for visiting, it's not for VFR travel, right? Most Asian Americans don't have family in the Caribbean or Europe. Of course, there are exceptions, but it really just shows a general affinity for travel and a willingness to spend. They out they outspend kind of the income differential in travel too. It's disproportionate. They just have a cultural interest in exploring and travel. And that is truly, yes, partly income, but partly just cultural. They also have an interest in luxury accommodations. I believe they're the only U.S. group that vastly under indexes on staying with friends and family when they travel, and they over index in paid accommodations. So those are all great, they're kind of cultural reasons, but those are great things to know as a travel brand, whether it's an airline, a hotel chain, a local property, or like an Airbnb, like a home sharing. Now, this is just kind of bird's eye view. Asians are spending more across automotive, travel, as you already mentioned, entertainment, with theme parks and dining out being primarily so travel, dining, entertainment. CPG, certain categories within CPG, baby care, skincare, hair care, oral care, feminine care, apparel, food meaning dining out, food at home, and takeaway, consumer tech, and then insurance and financial services. And that this covers not every category, but this really covers a lot of things. So a lot of times when we talk about income, we then hear, well, Asian, yeah, we know now Asian Americans are making more in terms of household income, but aren't they big savers? Like, they have high credit scores. They're not spending that money. But we can see that this is false. They are saving more, but they are also spending more across certain categories. It's just really important to understand what categories those are and why. And it's important to understand that, again, if you look at that graph that I showed earlier with the gap widening in income, they might be saving a little bit more than average, but they're also spending more than average, and that still leaves room for a differential there, for that savings. So these are all just, again, broad brush painting a picture. And now to wrap it up, I think going back to like why be on Asian endemic media sources, why be on relevant platforms, these are all data that I won't get into too granularly here, but we are going to share well, actually, we're not going to share the whole deck, but if anyone wants the full deck, you can contact me directly. My email address is at the end. It's DAYN at asianmedia.com. So DAYN at asianmedia.com can send you the full deck. But these data at the end are really just kind of tying it all into to how do we utilize these then. So this is the bullet point here, the top one. 80% of Asian Americans consider themselves ethnicity American rather than Asian American, which is huge. So, a Korean American would identify usually as a Korean or a Korean American, not just Asian American, primarily, which is why it's so important to have that specificity when you consider, media as well as creative and just kind of how you're thinking about the audience, making sure that you're working with partners that truly specialize in Asian, not just cultural or more multicultural, right? But really know how that audience works and how to get that, making sure that vendor is experienced with garnering response and performance and showing that kind of brand resonance or brand lift over time. Those are all really key to making sure that you don't misstep. Making sure that you're open to in-language media. I'm sure I don't know, again, I can't see who's on this call, but if you work for, a client, or if your client is one that doesn't want to consider in-language media, that needs to be, you absolutely need to change that. And language media is vital for making sure that you're getting adequate reach to the audience and that you're connecting with consumers, even if you don't have in-language creative. One of the questions that comes up a lot is whether you need it. And AMG works across, go back here, works across a huge variety of brands. Only about 92, and we did a study on this, I think this was 2022, 92% of the brands we work with, of our campaigns by spend, have English language creative for display. So that's 92%, the vast majority. Only 8% have in language creative. And for video, it turns into 98% having English language creative, 2% having in language creative. So making sure that you're utilizing in language or culturally endemic media, regardless of your creative availability, is key. This kind of goes back towards that 46% of Asian American audiences base their buying decisions on brands' diverse and inclusive efforts. One really good way to show that without additional investment is just to show up on those media sources. And they're highly motivated by family, making sure that that brand is showing that they include Asian Americans, that Asian Americans belong, not just from a creative perspective, which we understand, is something that really takes a pretty big lift in terms of investment and production, but just also from a media perspective. Beauty, everyone knows, is really key. Culture is so integral to beauty, whether that's skincare, hair care, or makeup. And so that's why we've worked with brands like Estee Lauder. I think they were like some of our first advertisers 36 years ago. So again, you can imagine what culture meant to them even back then. Now, lastly, I want to show kind of just again, brands we work with, as you can see, it crosses everything from consumer tech to entertainment to travel to luxury to telecom to consumer and luxury automotive, CPG, and B2B UPS there. And these are all, we've worked with a lot more brands, but these are just brands from the past like year or two that we've worked with recently. So you can see that momentum is there and that interest is there. These aren't like ancient news. And this is not comprehensive either, I do want to mention. And with some of these, with like for the portfolio brands like LVMH or P&G and GM, we do work with across multiple LOBs. So it's not just like some edge case that, in terms of how we work with them. And again, I do want to mention that we are 100% media direct. And so that makes it kind of extra impressive that a lot of those brands on the previous slide and a lot of these holding companies who are the most respected and largest ad agency holding companies, as you know, programmatic biggest line item, but they do make that exception to work with Asian Media Group consistently and with large investment levels year over year and every quarter because we do prove out that performance and drive that increased investment and make sure that brand resonance is measurable and is always there. So that is it for the slides. This is, again, my email is there and my name is there. If you want the full deck, feel free to contact me directly. I'll send it over as a PDF. But I know that we're almost at time, 8 minutes here, so I want to leave room for questions.
Okay, super. Thank you, Day. Day, well, really appreciate your great insights and all those wonderful data points. I'm going to ask our friends on the call to send in their questions in the Q&A box. Feel free to ask your questions. I think we have maybe about 5 or so minutes left. And Day, if you want to stop sharing your screen, we'll take some questions. I have one while we're waiting for people to put them in the chat. What benefit is there to advertisers running outside of the mainstream media universe to reach Asian Americans? I know you're an
Yeah.
expert on that topic, so.
Yeah, I think with mainstream media and like that word is just for lack of a better term, as everyone knows. With mainstream US media, you run into like just kind of you run into politics, as we all know right now. You run into the whole reason that so many advertisers are averse to news, even though on its face that doesn't necessarily make sense. But the whole reason they're averse to it is because, US mainstream media can be a bit like a civil war. They can be like just kind of really polarizing and have all these issues that are highly kind of offensive, to consumers, or potentially offensive, depending on the topic could be touchy. So I think when you go outside of the mainstream media universe, depending on where you go, of course, I will say, huge caveat to making sure that you're on brand safe media, but brand safe media outside of that mainstream media universe does allow for getting kind of away from those and making sure that you're connecting with consumers in different ways. So showing that you support, you're intentional about supporting media that connects with subcultures, subcultures meaning just anything under that huge mainstream culture in a consistent and intentional way.
Okay, great. So we have our first question. How do you usually measure the campaign success? 27% targeting accuracy is impressive. What other KPIs?
Yeah. So So there's it kind of depends, as you know, that really depends on the type of brand. So I think we're talking about big ticket items like a luxury brand or a car, where someone's not buying a car every 2 months, hopefully. We're looking at things like brand lift or in the absence of that, let's just say it's a test campaign, we'll kind of try to extrapolate through things like CTR or floodlights or whatever. I'm just speaking, I can only speak for my experience and our experience here at AMG. So other vendors might have different ways of going about it. But typically we're leaning on those third-party metrics. So that compatibility with vendors, third-party vendors that can, in a reliable way, measure lift among Asian American segments. I know like Lucid, Kantar, Circana, IRI for like CPGs. So we're really kind of complying with the whatever KPIs that brand uses. So while we might use brand lift for a car, we're probably going to lean more into like sales lift for a consumer packaged good. I mean, because that people, I do buy pads every month, whereas I don't necessarily buy a car. Sorry, TMI. No, we should be allowed to talk about that. So yeah, that's kind of, hope that answers your question. It really just does depend on the brand, but making sure that you're choosing a vendor that has that compatibility, that they're not going to be like, what does sales lift mean? That is
Yeah.
that is key.
Okay. Super. Here's another question. You talked about the importance of creative. How can we make sure creative is aligned with media for the Asian audience?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So as I said, you don't necessarily need to have creative like translated or tailored. You don't necessarily need to have like Asian creative. And again, lack of a better term, not sure how else to say that. You don't necessarily need to have like tailored creative. Of course, it is helpful, but with tailored creative, you do always have to remember that you do run the risk of offending people. So depending on, you need to make sure that the vendors you're working with are all aligned in what that creative. Let's take the worst case scenario. Worst case is actually really common, but let's say you have Asian creative, like you have a Indian model in your creative for your car. And now you programmatically deliver that to the Asian American audience. Indian American, it's the biggest segment, right? Should be able to get that. But you'll end up kind of going back to that lack of accuracy. You most likely will end up nowhere close to 27% accuracy, considering that you just narrowed it down to like needing a particular ethnicity. You have to remember that Asian American ethnicities also look really different. So that 27% accuracy isn't even, it's not even great, because you need to bring it down even further towards like what the accuracy is per ethnicity, which is just non-existent. It wasn't even on the chart, I think. Um, so again, that's not to put people off. It's just that you need to make sure that that vendor is delivering on accuracy when it comes to media, because your creative means nothing without being in front of the right people, right? A beautiful creative only means as much as the people appreciating it can deliver in terms of value.
Still waiting for questions. Those of you on the call still, if you could please type your questions into the Q&A box, we'll get to those. I do have another question, Day. You shared a lot of great stats. Is there one or two that you really want our friends on the call to take home with them and remember, that really spotlights the importance of our segment?
Yeah, I think
I
this
mean,
is
they
like
were all
hard. It's
great,
like I have like
great, great figures and facts, but just one that we want everyone to memorize and, remember.
yeah. I mean, I would say the one that we remember is that capitalizing on the billion dollar opportunity takes action, not just investigation, takes action, and to extent like anything, a little bit of a leap of faith. Now you can minimize that leap of faith by working with the right vendors, but
Right,
we
right.
see so often investigation lead to inaction and fear. Um, you need to actually do something for it to be able to seize the opportunity. I would say,
Yeah.
I know that's abstract and broad, but you know.
Yeah. Well, that was actually going to be my last question for you. What advice do you have for corporate marketers who are hesitant to jump into the Asian segment and start their brand journey? I get this question as the head of 3AF all the time, and I just tell them, don't be afraid. Jump in, put a stake in the ground. The consumers are watching. We have plenty of 3AF experts, such as you at Asian Media Group and other 3AF members, who can help you in your brand journey. And wanted you to elaborate on that as our last and final remark.
I guess the advice would be to make sure that you know what that fear is coming from. I know we're all scared of losing our jobs, we're all scared of making the wrong step and kind of the worst case scenario, but write down realistically what are the stumbling blocks? Is it a particular, Is it just overall kind of conservatism? Why try something new? Or is it lack of like reason to do it? Or is there like something really specific that the brand is worried about kind of misstepping on? Or is it just the most common thing I think is like, oh, we don't have enough money to try it out, and so that's why. But that doesn't really make sense, right? Because I don't think that, Gen Pop never doesn't have enough money. And that's just kind of supposed to cover everyone, right? So I think it's usually an excuse. So look at kind of what exactly it is that is stopping you from kind of at the end of the day saying, hey, why don't we try it out and see what it delivers. A test investment, it can't hurt that much, right? So I'd say write down those worries, kind of bring that to your leadership, whoever your leadership may be, and ask your vendors about it and kind of have those open and honest discussions. Again, you need to make sure that your vendors aren't just trying to push something that's not good for your brand. But that just goes back into, vetting of those vendors.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you're hesitant and you're not sure, 3F is your resource. We have plenty of experts who have been working in Asian marketing for 30 plus years, who can help you. Um, there was a question about general investment needed, but I think you answered that. So one question that we just came in, let's see, what's usually inside your programmatic buy scope? Google, meta ads, in language, endemic online sites, blogs, what else?
So we don't actually buy any programmatic media, which is how we're able to deliver on that ethnic accuracy. We're doing one-to-one. And that makes it sound not scalable, but our North American monthly unique impression base is 2.1 billion, and that's just above the fold. Like, so they're really, again, that 80% of people that were born overseas, there's a huge scale that people just aren't tapping into. But towards the actual question, like, so outside of Asian Media Group, if you had to do a programmatic buy, what would you include? I would say it's just you can use Google or Meta, you can use whatever, but I would just make sure you see where those ads are going. We've seen IAS reports that include Black People Meet and NBA.com as Chinese listed sites. And like, yes, Chinese people do like NBA more than probably like the average US. But yes, there are probably some Chinese Americans on blackpeoplemeet.com, but those it's not like that's not, really what the culture, like that's not really what you're trying to tap into. It's not getting that intentionality. So make sure that if you're going to do that, you know exactly where those ads are going, which is difficult, but make sure you know exactly kind of what is resonating, and where those are going. But I would say try to avoid tapping into this audience programmatically as a test.
Okay, super. Another question has come in. How far in advance is required to test a campaign? Can incremental budget possibilities be part of the conversation, or do campaigns need to be planned out far in advance?
Yeah, see, I like that question because it's so like practical. It's like, okay, like how do you use that then? Um, that it's like a long, potentially long answer. The answer is that no, it doesn't need to be planned out far in advance. But with the caveat that make sure that the vendor that you're working with, and I know this has been my answer to everything, make sure the vendor that you're working with is going to drive that performance regardless. So make sure that you have to understand kind of what their best practices are. Are their best practices totally dependent on having a perfect creative? Or are their best practices, making the creative work and being honest with you about whether that creative will work, and then like tying that into their media universe. So for example, we've had a last minute holiday campaign. This is last year with a telecom brand, and the creative, no Asians in the creative. It was like a white sales associate and like a black customer, buying the new iPhone or whatever. Video creative they used this like in banner video. That was very last minute. I think they did it with like a few weeks until Christmas. That performed really well. They were really happy about that test. It was just a test, so there wasn't like, so yeah, they can perform really well. You just have to make sure that the vendor that you're working with is like a media specialist, not, not just giving you creative advice.
Super. Okay, so we are actually out of time. We're actually over. Thank you all for your great questions. And again, Day, I want to thank you for your wonderful insights, your presentation, full of stats and figures about the importance of the Asian consumer segment was really helpful. And I hope all of you on the call were inspired. You know that 3F is your resource when it comes to Asian advertising, Asian marketing, and the power of the Asian American consumer. So as you think about what you're going to be doing in Asian, feel free to reach out to me or any of us at 3F if we can help you. And with that, thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Jenny, and thank you, 3F.
Sure. Bye.
Appreciate it. Have a great day.